In the beginning, meetings of the special group were infrequent. This may be explained in part by the special relationship that existed among CIA Director Allen Dulles, his brother John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, and President Eisenhower. Early in 1959, regular weekly meetings of the special group were instituted, with one result, that criteria for submission of projects to the group were, in practice, considerably broadened. It was not until March 1963, however, that criteria for submission to the special group became more formal and precise. These submission criteria are the same as exist today. See page 53. One other development during this period deserves mention. After a shoot-down of an American RB-47 aircraft in the Baltic region in June 1959, the special group adopted a new attitude toward reconnaissance in sensitive cases. They decided that review required for these missions had previously been inadequate and established review on a routine basis. The Joint Chiefs of Staff set up a Joint Reconnaissance Center, JRC, to present monthly peripheral reconnaissance programs to the special group. The new procedures did not prevent the U-2 incident in 1960. With the inauguration of President Kennedy in January 1961, special group meetings were transferred to the White House under the chairmanship of the President's Special Assistant for National Security Affairs, McGeorge Bundy. For a brief period, General Maxwell Taylor, President Kennedy's military advisor, chaired the group, but this role was again assumed by Bundy when Taylor became chairman of the JCS. Prior to 1961, the State Department member of the special group had been the quote informal and quote chairman. As a result of the failure of the Bay of Pigs, control procedures for the covert operations were tightened. The special group continued its once-a-week meeting format, and President Kennedy was informed more frequently of covert action proposals. At the same time, however, the control mechanism for approving and monitoring covert operations was fragmented. In addition to the special group, two new executive bodies were created: the Special Group on Counterinsurgency, CI, and the Special Group, Augmented. On January 18, 1963, NSAM 124 was issued. This directive established the Special Group, CI, to help ensure effective interagency programs designed to prevent and resist insurgency in specific critical areas, such as Laos. Paramilitary operations were a central focus of this new group. NSAM 124 did not, however, supersede the previous National Security Council operations that might have earlier been referred to the special group went to the special group counterinsurgency. General Maxwell Taylor chaired this group, among McGeorge Bundy and Robert Kennedy served on it, among others. In 1962, a third National Security Council subcommittee was established, the Special Group Augmented. Its purpose was to oversee Operation Mongoose, a major new CIA covert operation designed to overthrow Fidel Castro. Its membership included, in addition to the regular special group members, Attorney General Kennedy and General, end of page 59, beginning page 60, Taylor. Secretary of State Rusk and Secretary of Defense McNamara occasionally attended meetings. Footnote 18. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 18. For a detailed account of the workings of the special group, Augmented, see the committee's interim report on, quote, alleged assassination plots involving foreign leaders. end quote. Page 139 to 148. Resuming the reading. During the Johnson administration, the special group, which was renamed the 303 Committee, footnote 19, continued to be chaired by the President's Assistant for National Security Affairs, first George McBundy, and after 1966, Walt Rustow. Never mind. Once again, I apologize. I don't know how to pronounce every name. But I'm going to pause the reading and read footnote 19. In June 1964, NSAM 303 was issued. NSAM 303 left the composition, functions, and responsibilities of the special group unchanged. The effect of this directive was, quite simply, to change the name of the special group to the 303 Committee. The purpose of NSAM 303 was just as simple. The name of the special group had become public as a result of the publication of the book The Invisible Government, and therefore it was felt that the name of the Covert Action Approval Committee should be changed. Resuming the reading. The most important regular high-level meeting in the national security process during the Johnson years was, however, the Tuesday Lunch Group. The Tuesday Lunch began as an informal meeting of President Johnson, Secretary of State Rusk, Secretary of Defense McNamara, and Bundy. Gradually, the meetings became a regular occasion, and participation was enlarged to include the President's press secretary, the Director of Central Intelligence, and the chairman of the JCS. The agenda of the Tuesday lunch was devoted primarily to the operational decisions, mostly on Vietnam. Although the Tuesday lunch was not meant to substitute for the 303 Committee, it probably did consider important matters involving covert operations directed at North Vietnam. 2. The 40 Committee and current procedures. On February 17, 1970, NSDM 40 was issued. It created the 40 Committee. The directive superseded and rescinded past National Security Council Covert Action directives. It discussed both policy and procedure. With regard to policy, NSDM 40 stated that it was essential to the defense and security of the United States and its efforts for world peace that the overt foreign activities of the United States government continue to be supplemented by covert action operations. NSDM 40 assigned the Director of Central Intelligence responsibility for coordinating and controlling covert operations. The director was instructed to plan and conduct covert operations in a manner consistent with United States foreign and military policies, and to consult with and obtain appropriate coordination from any other interested agencies or officers on a need-to-know basis. The directive was also spelled out the role of the 40 Committee. It stated that the Director of Central Intelligence was responsible for obtaining policy approval for all major and or politically sensitive covert action programs throughout the 40 Committee. In addition, NSDM 40 continued the committee's responsibility for reviewing and approving overhead reconnaissance missions, a responsibility first acquired in 1959. A new provision not found in previous National Security Council directives required the committee to annually review covert operations previously approved and made the Director of Central Intelligence responsible for ensuring that the review took place. Guidelines for the submission of covert action proposals to the 40 Committee were spelled out in an internal CIA directive, footnote 20. Pausing the reading footnote 20. This directive will, at least initially, continue in effect for the new Operations Advisory Group. Resuming the reading. The Director of Central Intelligence decided whether an operational program, end of page 60, beginning page 61, or activity should be submitted to the 40 Committee for a policy approval. The paramount consideration was political sensitivity, but it was also significant if the program involved large sums of money. In the past, a, quote, large, end quote, project was one costing over $25,000, but this guideline seems less clear today. As a general rule, the following types of programs or activities required 40 committee action: political and propaganda action programs involving direct or indirect action to influence or support political parties, groups, or specific political or military leaders. This included governmental and opposition elements, economic action programs, paramilitary programs, and counterinsurgency programs where the CIA involvement is other than the support and improvement of the intelligence collection capabilities of the local services. The internal CIA directive also stated that before proposals were presented to the Director of Central Intelligence for submission to the 40 Committee, they should be coordinated with the Department of State. Further, paramilitary action programs should be coordinated with the Department of Defense and ordinarily concurred by the ambassador to the country concerned would be required. Emphasis added. Quote, should, end quote, and quote, ordinarily, end quote, were underscored for an important reason. Major covert action proposals are not always coordinated among the various departments, nor for that matter were they always discussed or approved by the 40 Committee. For example, the CIA's 1970 effort to promote a military coup d'etat in Chile, undertaken at the instruction of President Nixon, was never brought before the 40 Committee. After a proposal was approved by the Director of Central Intelligence, it was distributed in the memorandum form to the 40 Committee principals. Footnote 21. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 21. The memorandum described the proposal in summary form, what it was expected to accomplish, its cost, and the availability of funds, whether there were alternative means for achieving the objectives sought, and the risks involved and the possible consequences of disclosure. Resuming the reading. Except in emergencies, distribution to the principals was to occur at least 72 hours in advance of a meeting. Normally, the written proposal, as contained in the 40 Committee memorandum, was formally considered following an oral presentation by the CIA. This presentation was usually given by the agency division chief having action responsibility. In addition to the principals, participants at the 40 Committee included, on occasion, the CIA's Deputy Director for Operations, a representative from the State Department's Bureau of Investigation and Research, and the Assistant Secretary of the State for the region involved. The 40 Committee should approve, modify, or reject any covert action proposal. Proposals involving continuing action, for example, a subsidy to a political group, were normally approved for a fixed period, 1 year or less, at the end of which the project was again reviewed by the committee and either continued or eliminated. Reconnaissance programs were rarely dealt with at these meetings. They were usually cleared by telephone vote rather than at the formal meeting. Prior to 1969, It does not appear that all 40 committee approvals were routinely referred to the President. The President would become involved formally only if there was disagreement within the committee, or if the chairman or another member thought a proposal was, end of page 61, beginning page 62, sufficiently important or sensitive to warrant the President's attention. However, as a result of the Hughes-Ryan Amendment to the 1974 Foreign Assistance Act, the President is notified once a covert action proposal has been approved by his executive committee. The President is then required to certify to Congress that the approved covert action proposal is, quote, important to the national security interests of the United States, end quote. The Director of Central Intelligence then informs the Congress of this, quote, presidential finding, end quote, in a, quote, timely manner, end quote. In practice, informing Congress means notifying 6 different committees: the Senate and the House committees on armed services, foreign relations, and appropriations. Footnote 22. Pausing the reading, reading footnote 22. In addition, both the Senate and House Select Committees on Intelligence Activities were briefed on current covert operations. Resuming the reading. The Director of Central Intelligence does not, however, feel obligated to inform the 6 committees of approved covert action operations prior to their implementation, although in some cases he has done so. Once the, quote, presidential finding, end quote, is in hand, the CIA's Directorate of Operations implements the proposal. During the early years of the Nixon administration, 40 committee meetings were held regularly, although, on occasion, proposals were approved by telephone vote. Over time, however, formal meetings became fewer and fewer. This was due, in part, to a decline in covert action projects. Most business was done by telephone after proposals had been circulated in advance by couriers. Business became routine, quote, telephone concurrences, unquote, involving quick checks rather than intensive discussion was the rule. However, for major new departures, the committee met in person. For example, the 40 committee met 9 times between January 22nd and December 11th, 1975, to discuss Angola. The National Security Council met once on June 27, 1975. In addition, an interagency working group on Angola met 24 times between August 13, 1975 and January 14, 1976. The number and frequency of meetings on Angola appears to reflect a need on the part of policymakers to sit down and discuss the desirability and mechanics of undertaking a major new covert operation. When a new departure is not being considered, when policy and interests are not shifting, 40 committee business remained routine, usually conducted by telephone. 2 additional points concerning 40 committee procedures are important. First, covert action proposals were resubmitted by the Director of Central Intelligence to the 40 committee when there was a need to reassess or reaffirm previous policy decisions. Resubmission would occur if new developments warranted it or if specifically required by the 40 committee at the time of approval. Second, status reports on covert action programs and activities were submitted when requested by the 40 committee or at the discretion of the Director of Central Intelligence. Status reports were presented at least annually to the 40 Committee for each continuing activity approved by the committee. Apparently, however, these annual reviews were little more than pro forma. Exercises carried out by the Director of Central Intelligence. They were not thorough examinations of ongoing projects by the 40 Committee principals. Footnote 23. Reading footnote 23. According to the CIA, prior to the review of these annual reports by the 40 Committee principals, they were submitted in draft to the concerned agencies for comment. Thus, the staff of the 40 Committee principals had an opportunity to examine ongoing projects. The end of page 62, the beginning of page 63. Three, covert action proposals. It is difficult to determine the number of covert operations approved over the years by the 40 Committee or its predecessors. Records for the early years are either not available or are incomplete. Also, there has been a steady refinement of, quote, programs, unquote, into individual, quote, projects, unquote, thus making comparisons difficult. A rough determination can be made of projects approved for the period 1949 to 1967. Footnote 24. Pausing the reading. Reading footnote 24. These numbers may include reapprovals of projects initiated earlier. Resuming the reading. Between 1949 and 1952, 81 projects were approved by the Director of Central Intelligence on his own authority after coordination with either the 10/2 or 10/5 panels. During the first 2 years of the Eisenhower administration, 1953-54, 66 projects were approved by the Director of Central Intelligence in coordination with the Operations Coordination Board or the Psychological Strategy Board. Between March 1955 and February 1967, projects approved or reconfirmed by the Operations Coordination Board, the Special Group, or the 303 Committee were as follows: Eisenhower Administration, 104. Kennedy Administration, 163. Johnson Administration, 142. These totals reflect two things. First, an increase in the number of projects approved, and second, a tightening up of approval procedures. Regarding procedures, a CIA memorandum dated February 25, 1967 stated, "As the sophistication of the policy approval procedures developed, so did the participation of the external approving authority. Since establishment of the special group, later 303 Committee, the policy arbiters have questioned CIA presentations, amended them, and on occasion denied them outright. The record shows that the group/committee in some instances has overridden objectives from the Director of Central Intelligence and instructed the agency to carry out certain activities. Operations by state have resulted in amendment or rejection of election proposals, suggestions for air proprietaries, and support plans for foreign governments. The committee has suggested areas where covert action is needed, has decided that another element of government should undertake a proposed action imposed caveats and turned down specific proposals for CIA action from ambassadors in the field, whereas the, quote, sophistication of the policy approval process, end quote, and the, quote, participation of the external approving authority has increased significantly since the establishment of the special group in 1955 has not meant that all, or even a majority, of covert action projects have been approved by the, quote, external approving authority, end quote. Low-risk, low-cost covert action projects, such as a routine press placement or the development of an, quote, agent of influence, end quote, do not receive this attention. In this regard, an agency memorandum dated February 21st, 1967 stated, "It is obvious that a compilation of special group approvals in no way reflects the totality of significant CIA activities carried on over the past 15 years. With respect to overall," end of page 63, beginning page 64, "DDP activity does not include any mention of FI/CI, foreign intelligence, counterintelligence, actions, or, of course, any decisions in the overt field. Even within the restricted framework of covert action alone, a 1963 study prepared by this office showed that of the 550 existing CIA projects of the DDP, which were reviewed against the background of our own internal instruction on the special group submission, only 86 were separately approved or reapproved by the special group between 1st of January and 1st of December 1962. Using the figures cited above, this would mean that 16% of all covert action projects, large and small, received special group approval between January 1st and December 1st, 1962. The Select Committee's own review indicates that of the several thousand covert action projects undertaken since 1961, only 14% were considered on a case-by-case basis by the 40 Committee or its predecessors. Footnote 25. Reading footnote 25. According to the CIA, since the Hughes-Ryan Amendment to the 1974 Foreign Assistance Act, all covert action projects not submitted on a case-by-case basis have been submitted to the President for approval and to the Oversight Committees of Congress for its information in collective omnibus form. Resuming the reading. Those not reviewed by the committee were the low-risk, low-cost type referred to above. Another indication of the number of covert action proposals which eventually reached the 40 Committee is contained in the CIA's 1972 Covert Action Manual. According to this document, quote, "The 40 Committee actually looks at about 1/4 of our covert action projects," end quote. The manual continues, "This proportion is a reflection on the nature of the project system, not on any lack of a policy approval for our covert actions. For example, the agency would have separate projects for each of a number of media assets that might be brought to bear on an overall program of persuasion, but the 40 Committee would focus on the program with its descriptions of the specific assets to be employed. Thus, the important point on policy is that the 40 Committee considers individually all major and critical projects, providing broader program guidelines for the remainder of our covert activity." Emphasis added. 4. The National Security Council and Covert Activities. Conclusions. Several points stand out in the history of the committees charged with overseeing covert actions. The most obvious has less to do with procedures than with the substance of the projects approved. The justification for covert operations has changed sharply from containing international and presumably monolithic communism in the early 1950s to merely serving as an adjunct to American foreign policy in the 1970s. It should be noted that early National Security Council directives framed the purpose of covert actions entirely in terms of opposition to international communism. By contrast, NSDM 40 described covert actions as those secret activities designed to further official United States programs and policies abroad. End of page 64. Beginning of page 65. As stated, procedural arrangements for considering and approving covert operations have been formalized and tightened over the years. NSC-4-A of 1947 established no formal procedures for coordinating or approving operations. The Director of Central Intelligence, in liaison with State and Defense, was to ensure that operations were consistent with United States policy. Over time, procedures were developed and guidelines established to indicate which covert action proposals required 40 committee approval. The requirement of a, quote, presidential finding, end quote, in the 1974 Foreign Assistance Act not only requires the president to certify to Congress that an approved covert operation is important to the national security of the United States, but in effect compels him to become aware of, actions approved by the 40 Committee. Footnote 26. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 26. President Ford has recommended that the, quote, presidential finding, end quote, requirement it be dropped. In his message to Congress outlining his intelligence reorganization, the President recommended that the 1974 Foreign Assistance Act, Public Law 93-559, be modified as proposed by the Commission on the Organization of the Government for the Conduct of Foreign Policy. That commission, charged by Robert Murphy, recommended, quote, we propose that Public Law 93-599 be amended to require reporting of covert actions to the proposed Joint Committee on National Security, and to omit any requirement for the personal certification of the President as to their necessity, end quote. Commission on the Organization of the Government for the Conduct of Foreign Policy, 6/75, page 101. Resuming the reading, the concept of plausible denial, at least as it applies to the President, is dead. Major new covert operations cannot be undertaken without the knowledge and approval of the Chief Executive. President Ford's executive order takes this one step further. The new Operations Advisory Group will not be responsible for policy approval of covert operations, as was the 40 Committee. According to the executive order, the group will, quote, reconsider and develop any policy recommendation, including any dissents, for the President prior to his decision, end quote, on each covert operation. The approval of covert operations now rests solely with the President. However, recognition that procedural arrangements for considering and approving covert operations have become tighter does not necessarily imply that they are adequate. Significant issues regarding the control of covert operations remain. First, the criteria for determining which covert operations are brought before the executive are still inadequate. Small covert action projects not deemed politically risky can be approved within the CIA. Although many of these are in support of projects already approved by the executive, they nevertheless make up a majority of all CIA covert action projects. In addition, some of the low-risk projects approved within the CIA, such as the development of a foreign, quote, asset, end quote, may prove to be extremely sensitive and risky. Once, excuse me. One CIA, quote, asset, end quote, given the cryptonym QJ/WIN, was recruited to spot, quote, individuals with criminal and underworld connections in Europe for possible multi-purpose use, end quote. Footnote 27. Pausing the reading footnote 27. Senate Select Committee, quote, alleged assassination plots involving foreign leaders, end quote. Page 182. See this report for a full discussion of QJ/WIN, ZR/RIFLE, WI/ROGUE, and AM/LASH. Resuming the reading. Later, the CIA contemplated using QJ/WIN for its ZR/RIFLE project, a, quote, general standby capability, end quote, to carry out assassination when required. Other CIA individual project, quote, assets, end quote, used in connection with plots to assassinate foreign leaders were WI/ROGUE and AM/LASH. End of page 65, beginning page 66. Though none of these specific projects were apparently approved by the NSC, or National Security Council, several ranking CIA officials testified that they were within the general policy approved at the National Security Council level. Second, there were gaps in the 40 committee supervision. Notably in the sensitive areas of human espionage and counterintelligence. Whether intended or not, espionage and counterintelligence operations may have the effect of political action. A former chairman of the special group, McGeorge Bundy, has testified that the distinction among these operations needs re-examination. According to Bundy, intelligence collection is often separated from covert operations in the thinking of intelligence administrators and other concerned officials. I think this distinction, like the parallel distinction in the field of counterintelligence, deserves re-examination. Both intelligence collection and counterintelligence have involved covert activity which goes well beyond conventional espionage and counterespionage. And such enlargements of activity often present many of the same dangers as covert actions of other sorts. Footnote 28. Pausing the reading footnote 28. McGeorge Bundy Testimony, House Select Committee on Intelligence, December 10th, 75. Resuming the reading. Espionage operations can have the effect of political action. A payment to a dissident leader may be designed to collect intelligence on the leader's group, but it may also be regarded as support for the group's objectives. Counterintelligence operations can have a similar impact. Counterintelligence measures used to enlist the support of local intelligence and police neutralize hostile intelligence services and discredit local CIA opponents are sometimes indistinguishable from covert action. As such, the issue is whether these intelligence activities can or should be made subject to effective executive branch and congressional oversight. President Ford's executive order does not address this issue. The Operations Advisory Group will be held responsible for approving certain, quote, official sensitive collection operations, end quote, but the executive order does not apparently include human as well as technical collection, nor is there any reference to operations group review or approval of any counterintelligence activities. Third, there is a basic conflict between sufficient consultation to ensure accountability and sound decisions on the one hand, and secure operations on the other. 40 committee approval procedures for covert operations were on occasion bypassed by the President or his National Security Affairs advisor. For highly sensitive proposals, the number of individuals or agencies consulted or informed is sometimes sharply limited on a, quote, need to know, end quote, basis. Even the ambassador in the country where the operation is to be conducted may not be informed. Middle and lower level officials within the State Department or the CIA with expertise may not be consulted. The risk of inadequate consultation was aggravated by the informality of telephone clearances. President Ford's executive order attempts to remedy this deficiency, at least in part. The executive order states, the operations group shall discharge the responsibilities assigned only after consultation in a formal meeting attended, or at, end of page 66, beginning of page 67, tended by all members and observers, or when a designated representative of the member or observer attends. Footnote 28a. Pausing the reading footnote 28a. Executive Order 1905, Section 3C3. Resuming the reading. Finally, the annual review of covert actions by the 40 Committee did not appear to be searching or thorough. Annual reviews were often handled in the same informal manner as approvals for new covert action proposals by telephone concurrence. Some ongoing covert operations have been challenged over the years, most often by the State Department. Some die a natural death. Some linger for as long as 20 to 25 years. It appears that some covert operations, such as those in Italy, may come to an end only when they are exposed. President Ford's executive order contains two provisions to increase the number of covert action reviews. First, the Operations Advisory Group will be required to, quote, conduct periodic reviews of programs previously considered, end quote. There is no requirement, however, that these reviews must take place at a formal meeting. Second, The executive order requires the full National Security Council to review twice a year the, quote, continued appropriateness, end quote, of ongoing covert operations. 5. The role of OMB. In order to meet unanticipated needs, sorry, one moment. In order to meet unanticipated needs, the CIA maintains a contingency reserve fund. The fund is replenished by annual appropriations as well as unobligated funds from previous CIA appropriations. More often than not, the unanticipated needs of the CIA relate to covert operations. The Director of Central Intelligence has the authority under the Central Intelligence Agency Act of 1949 to spend reserve funds without consulting OMB. However, due to an arrangement among OMB and the CIA, OMB, the CIA, and the Appropriations Committee of Congress, the CIA has agreed not to use reserve funds without OMB approval. There is no evidence that the Director of Central Intelligence has ever violated this agreement. In practice, OMB holds a double key to this reserve fund. First, it approves additions to the reserve fund, and second, it approves the amounts to be released from the fund. Upon CIA request and justification, OMB holds a careful review of each proposed release. Turndowns are rare, but reductions in amounts requested occur often enough to prompt a careful CIA presentation of its case. Despite these levers of control, OMB has faced several handicaps which render its control of the contingency reserve fund less effective than it might be. First, OMB has not in the past been represented on the National Security Council or the 40 Committee. Footnote 29. Pausing the reading footnote 29. Under President Ford's executive order, the director of OMB will sit as an observer on the Operations Advisory Group, the successor to the 40 Committee. Resuming the reading. Much of the dollar volume of reserve releases originate in 40 Committee action. Thus, OMB resistance to reserve release requests were often in the face of policy determinations already made. Second, although the chairman of the appropriations subcommittees of Congress are notified of drawdowns from the fund, these notifications occur after the release action, even though the release is conceptually the same as a supplemental appropriation. Thus, OMB does not have the leverage in regard to, end of page 67, beginning page 68, contingency reserve fund, release that it does in regard to supplemental appropriations requests, where OMB is a party to recommending supplementals to the President and Congress. OMB suffers other limitations with respect to the use of CIA funds for covert operations. First, CIA's budget submission to OMB has for covert operations. Let me read that again. OMB suffers other limitations with respect to the use of CIA funds for covert operations. First, CIA's budget submission to OMB has, in the past, neglected some aspects of clandestine spending, notably proprietary activities. Second, current ground rules allow the reprogramming of CIA's regular appropriations to meet unanticipated needs. No OMB approval is required for this reprogramming. To the extent that the above funds are used for covert operations, OMB has no control over their use. C. Providing the intelligence required by policymakers. 1. The work of the National Security Council Intelligence Committee. The National Security Council Intelligence Committee was formed in November 1971. At its first meeting, a working group composed primarily of officials from the intelligence community was established. That composition was soon seen as inappropriate for a committee whose main purpose was to make intelligence more responsive to the needs of policy-making, quote, consumers, end quote. As a result, at its second and last meeting, the NSCIC changed the composition of the working group to exactly parallel the parent body. Footnote 30. Pausing the reading footnote 30. The Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, Chairman, and Director of Central Intelligence, Vice Chairman, the Deputy Secretaries of State and Defense, the Chairman, JCS, and Undersecretary of Treasury for Monetary Affairs. Resuming the reading. The various representatives who sat on the working group were not the, quote, intelligence, end quote, specialists from those agencies, but officials with policy-making responsibilities. For example, the State Department was represented by the Director of the Bureau of Politico-Military Affairs, not the Director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Representatives were to seek the views of the operating bureaus of their agencies on major intelligence questions. On an August 1974 meeting of National Security Council Intelligence Committee produced two direct results. In response to a request for some mechanism to highlight critical intelligence memoranda, the Director of Central Intelligence now puts out, quote, alert memoranda, end quote, brief notices in form which cannot be overlooked. The meeting also resulted in the production of a National Intelligence Estimate, NIE, on Soviet perceptions of the United States. Before it was abolished, the National Security Council Intelligence Committee began reviewing the basic documents which levy requirements on the intelligence community. The Director of Central Intelligence's perspectives on intelligence, substantive objectives, and especially key intelligence questions, KIQs. NSCIC also set up a working group panel to conduct surveys of intelligence community publications. There was also an NSCIC subcommittee which considered economic intelligence by the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for International Affairs. The subcommittee was inactive. End of page 68, beginning page 69. 2. Limitations on effectiveness. NSCIC's work reflected the basic dilemma inherent in suiting intelligence to the needs of policymakers. The intelligence community must be close enough to policymakers to know what is desired, yet distant enough to preserve its objectivity. Within this framework, the differing demands of many kinds of policy makers must be balanced. For example, the intelligence community more responsive to the needs of the cabinet level officials might diminish the quality of intelligence produced from middle level officials. The limited effectiveness of NSCIC was due to several factors. The apparent lack of interest of senior officials in making NSCIC work. The demands of other business on the sub-cabinet level officials who made up NSCIC. Consumer and unfamiliarity with the intelligence community. Of necessity, NSCIC spent most of its time educating policymakers about the community and what it can do. Most officials in policy-making positions, especially those in senior positions, bring little intelligence experience to their jobs. One of the NSCIC's first tasks was to produce a manual about the community for policymakers. Diversity among, quote, consumers, end quote, cooperative arrangements, and the tradition of working together are matters of long standing within the intelligence community. By contrast, NSCIC represented a first attempt to bring, quote, consumers, end quote, together. The newness of the endeavor combined with the diversity of the, quote, consumers, end quote, made it difficult for the NSCIC to function effectively. 3. Conclusions. The intelligence community has not always been responsive to the needs of policymakers. Some have argued that the intelligence product is more a reflection of what, quote, producers, end quote, rather than the, quote, consumers, end quote, deem important. This is debatable. What is not at issue, however, is that, quote, consumers, end quote, should drive the intelligence process. NSCIC was a disappointment in this regard. To say this is not to imply that the intelligence community has been unresponsive to the needs of policymakers. Just the opposite may be true. Quote, producers, end quote, consumers, end quote, get together almost daily at the National Security Council subcommittee meetings, e.g., the Senior Review Group and the Washington Special Action Group. Intelligence requirements are levied informally at these meetings. It can be assumed that the intelligence community has been responsive to these informal requirements, and hence the need for a more formal NSC mechanism, NSCIC, was eliminated. The new Committee on Foreign Intelligence will now have the responsibility for seeing that policymakers provided the intelligence they need. D. Advertising the president on intelligence issues. 1. Overview. The president needs an independent body to assess the quality and effectiveness of our foreign intelligence effort. Since 1956, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, PFIAB, has served this function. Numerous proposals have recently been made to make. End of page 69, beginning page 70. PFIAB, an executive, quote, watchdog, end quote, over United States foreign intelligence activities. Some have suggested that a joint presidential/congressional intelligence board may be established or At the least, Senate confirmation of members of the President's board be required. The Rockefeller Commission recommended that the board's functions be expanded to include oversight of the CIA with responsibility for assessing CIA compliance with its statutory authority. The Murphy Commission commented favorably on the Rockefeller Commission recommendations. Whether President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board should adopt this oversight or, quote, watchdog, end quote, function, or whether Congress should be involved in the activities of the board is open to question. President Ford, in his executive order, decided against transforming the board into a CIA watchdog. Instead, he created a new 3-member intelligence oversight board to monitor the activities of the intelligence community. 2. History of President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. On February 6, 1956, President Eisenhower created, by executive order, the Board of Consultants on Foreign Intelligence Activities. The board was established in response to a recommendation by the Second Hoover Commission, calling for the President to appoint a committee of private citizens who would report to him on United States foreign intelligence activities. Creation of the board was also intended to preempt a move in Congress at the time, led by Senator Mike Mansfield, to establish a joint congressional committee on intelligence. The board ceased functioning when President Eisenhower left office in 1961, but was reactivated by President Kennedy following the Bay of Pigs failure. It was renamed the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, PFIAB, and has functioned uninterrupted since that time. PFIAB today. 3. The board currently operates under Executive Order 11460, issued by President Nixon on March 20, 1969. The board is responsible for reviewing and assessing United States foreign intelligence activities. It reports to the President periodically on its findings and recommendations for improving the effectiveness of the nation's foreign intelligence effort. The board presently has 17 members, all drawn from private life and all appointed by the President. It is chaired by Leo Chern and holds formal meetings 2 days every other month. It has a staff of 2 headed by an executive secretary. As its name indicates, the board is advisory. Board reports and recommendations have contributed to the increased effectiveness and efficiency of our intelligence effort. For example, the board played a significant role in the development of our overhead reconnaissance program. It made recommendations on coordinating American intelligence activities, reorganizing defense intelligence, applying science and technology to the National Security Agency, and rewriting the National Security Council Intelligence Directives, NSCIDS. The board has conducted post-mortems on alleged intelligence failures, and since 1969 made a yearly independent assessment of the Soviet strategic threat, thereby supplementing regular community intelligence. End of page 70, beginning page 71. Assessments. Most recently, it has reported to the President on economic intelligence and human clandestine intelligence collection. I will stop here for today's recording.